Hey everyone, how's it going? So I'm here for the My Neck of the Woods tag, which is a tag that was created by Kelly from Books I'm Not Reading, and she sort of tagged me in the comments. She replied to a comment I left on her original video, telling me I should do it, and so I had considered myself tagged, but just hadn't gotten around to doing it. But then Alex from What Page Are You On actually did explicitly tag me in his video, and so that was a good kick in the pants for me to do this. I will leave links to both of their videos. Thank you both for tagging me, and so this is just a very simple tag where you talk about some books by authors from your neck of the woods, or about books that take place in your neck of the woods. And Kelly and Alex and Steve Donahue, when he did this tag, all define their neck of the woods as just their home state, even though Kelly actually kind of left it open as to how you're going to define my neck of the woods. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to go with my home state of New York. So I'm from upstate New York, about 3.5 hours north of New York City. And that's something I often have to explain to people over and over again, because it turns out when you tell people you're from New York, they usually just assume you're from New York City. People who are from New York, who aren't from New York City, love to bitch about this, and with good reason, because it is very annoying. But I'm from near Albany, which is the state capital, unfortunately, all of the authors I have to talk about today lived in or are from New York City. So I wish I had more books by or about authors from upstate New York, but I just don't know of that many. And it's probably part of the New York City has produced a lot of great writers, not to brag, but it has. Even though I think New York City is vastly overrated, but that's a rant for another time. So anyway, I'm just going to talk about these authors, because they're all great authors, despite the fact that they're from a god-awful city. But the first two are classics, and they don't really need much introduction. We have Moby-Dick by Herman Melville and Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. And actually, Walt Whitman and Herman Melville actually lived in New York City around the same time as each other. They probably didn't know each other, and there's no record that they ever met, which is kind of cool. And actually, another author I'm going to talk about in a minute sort of fantasizes that at one point in an interview, Harold Bloom, by the way, fantasizes in an interview at one point about these two authors who didn't know each other, neither knew how great the other was, just sort of casually walking by each other without even noticing each other. But yeah, I don't think these need much introduction. I have made no secret of my love for Moby-Dick, one of my favorite novels ever, and I love the poetry of Walt Whitman as well. It is just great poetry to read on a rainy afternoon, or to shout out from the top of a tall building, which is pretty appropriate for New York City. Next is a slew of poets, and somehow they're all like mid-20th century to late 20th century poets. I don't know how that happened. But so I have here Frank O'Hara. This is slim volume lunch poems. John Ashbery, Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, which won the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and the National Book Critics Circle Award, which is an insane slew of awards. And John Ashbery was actually also the New York State Poet Laureate for a couple of years. And he also did actually live in upstate New York for a while. I found this out actually when I bought this book, because I bought it in a Barnes & Noble in upstate New York, and the cashier saw it and was like, "Oh yeah, he's a local author." And I was like, "Oh really?" He's like, "Yeah, he teaches at Bard College, which is a small liberal arts college in upstate New York." So yeah, John Ashbery and the last poet, James Merrill, you can see photographed there and there. All three of these poets are well known as pretty difficult poets. I can't really make head or tail of any of them as of now. I have read the title poem in this collection and loved it. It was a 15-page long poem, and it took me an hour and a half to read. So that is where that's where John Ashbery's at. But I've loved everything I've read by John Ashbery, even if I don't feel like I grasp it that well. And then Frank O'Hara is he's odd. He wrote his poems in this very Spitfire way. So he would just dash them off really quickly in like one draft and then send them off to get published. But that's crazy to me because of how complex and interesting they are. And I need to reread. I've marked off some of my favorite poems here. I need to reread them and see if I can try to like dissect them a bit more. And then James Merrill is well known as a very difficult poet. He's a heavily autobiographical poet. And this is just a selection of his poems. And then this is the first third of his epic poem, The Changing Light at Sandover. So The Changing Light at Sandover is this long epic poem which chronicles James Merrill's communication with dead people through a Ouija board, which is a super weird but really intriguing premise. The Changing Light at Sandover sounds like it's very difficult, like all of James Merrill's poetry, and the reason I was attracted to buying this is because it's the first section, so it's divided into 3 sections, like, sort of, I think, somewhat modeled off of Dante's Divine Comedy, but this is the first section, and it's, it has a long introduction and and extensive notes in the back, on the text. In fact, only about half of this volume is the actual text of the poem. And I feel like reading this in this edition with these explanatory notes might help me to understand the rest of the poem when I go to read it, because I do want to read the entire poem. But yeah, The Changing Light at Sandover, not something I've read, but want to read. And then the last author here is probably the one I have the most to say about, and I've mentioned him already, Harold Bloom. This is his book, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, which is now infamous on BookTube for being a less than satisfactory guide to Shakespeare. I like this book. There are parts of it that I really, really enjoyed and thought were very interesting. The chapters on Hamlet and on the 2 parts of Henry IV, in particular, I really enjoyed. I also thought his analysis of Othello was really interesting. I didn't really agree with his analysis of Othello, but it was still very interesting, because he goes through this long argument. He tries to posit that Othello and Desdemona had not consummated their marriage. And it was just interesting to see him try to argue that out. I wasn't convinced, but it was still interesting. But his overall thesis in this book is that Shakespeare essentially changed the way humans think about themselves. Essentially, Shakespeare gave birth to the way that we think of being human in the modern world. And I don't know, it's kind of a silly premise. It's kind of a silly argument, if you ask me, just because there are so many people in the world who would not have ever gotten exposed to Shakespeare. But anyway, that aside, there are some really good parts to this book, and there are some parts that I really could live without. But this other book of his that I have here is one that I really, really like. It's his Best Poems of the English Language, which is an anthology of poems that he put together of just, as he sees it, all the greatest poems in English, from Chaucer to Robert Frost. And what's great about this, as well as the poems, is his introductions to each of the poets and the poems. So he has little biographical sketches and sometimes critical introductions to each of the poets. And I really loved that, because that's something I really need for poetry. A guide, essentially, to sort of hold my hand, essentially. Because poetry is difficult to read, especially when you're just starting out. And it's nice to have someone to sort of give you a bit of a grounding in each individual poet's work. And I wanted it because I wanted a nice sort of introduction to just all of English poetry, essentially. Just something to give me a basic education in English poetry, and this seemed like a good place to go. Again, not only just because of the poems, but also because of the introductions, and because it's not too long. It's almost 1,000 pages, but that's, by anthologies of English poetry standards, that is actually not that long. You know, there's the Norton Anthology, there's the Oxford Book of English Verse, which are both insane, these, 1,000 plus, 1,500 page plus volumes. And I wanted to steer clear of those, because those would just intimidate me. and the introductions again make it much easier. So yeah, that is the My Neck of the Woods tag. I will tag some people in the description, and thank you all for watching. Thank you for creating the tag, Kelly, and thank you for tagging me, Alex. And yeah, I will see you all next weekend probably. Bye, guys.